December 1944. The Ardennes forest. The American infantrymen shivering in their frozen foxholes didn't see it first. They felt it. The frozen ground beneath their boots began to vibrate. Deep in the freezing, impenetrable fog, heavy pine trees, some of them 80 feet tall, were snapping in half like wooden toothpicks. Then came the sound. It wasn't just the roar of an engine. It was a mechanical scream, the deafening, metallic screech of massive steel tracks crushing the frozen earth, driven by a massive Maybach V12 engine. And then, the monster emerged from the thick gray mist. The Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausführung B. The King Tiger, an American anti-tank crew, hidden in the tree line, panicked. They aimed their 75mm gun and fired an armor-piercing shell perfectly into the chest of the beast. Crack. The heavy shell hit the German tank dead center. And then, the impossible happened. The shell just bounced off. It deflected into the gray sky like a thrown pebble bouncing off a solid brick wall. The King Tiger didn't even slow down. This massive turret slowly rotated. The gun fired once, and the American position simply ceased to exist in a cloud of fire and pulverized snow. This was not just a tank. It was a psychological weapon. It was designed to break the minds of men before it ever broke their lines. Back in the Henschel weapons factories in Germany, this was exactly what the engineers had calculated. They had taken the terrifyingly thick armor of the original Tiger tank, and they sloped it. The upper front plate of the King Tiger was 150mm of pure Krupp steel, angled precisely at 50 degrees. In the brutal physics of armored warfare, sloping the armor meant that an enemy shell had to travel through significantly more metal to penetrate the hull. It effectively doubled the thickness. It made the front of the King Tiger mathematically impenetrable to almost every weapon the American army possessed. And then, there was the gun. The 88mm Kampfwagenkanon 43. It fired an armor-piercing shell at a velocity of over 3,300 feet per second. It flew so fast, and so flat, that it defied gravity. A German gunner could spot an American Sherman tank sitting over 2 miles away, and put a shell straight through its thickest armor. The sheer kinetic energy would ignite the fuel and vaporize the crew inside instantly. When it was fully loaded, the King Tiger weighed 70 tons. 70 tons. The German High Command believed that perfection, massive weight, and absolute firepower could win the war. They believed the King Tiger was invincible. And looking at the burning American positions in the snow, they were absolutely right. But a few miles down a muddy logging trail, parked silently in the freezing brush near a Belgian town called Saint Vith, was an American vehicle that the German engineers would have laughed at. It was the M8 Greyhound. If the King Tiger was a 70-ton heavyweight champion made of solid iron, the Greyhound was an 8-ton mosquito. It was not even a tank. It was an armored car. It had 6 rubber tires instead of heavy steel tracks. The American cavalry designed it for one specific purpose: to sneak and peek. It was supposed to drive fast, scout the enemy lines, and report back over the radio. It was never, ever, supposed to stand and fight, to keep the vehicle fast. The American designers had stripped away almost everything that kept a soldier safe. The armor on the Greyhound was terrifyingly thin. At its thickest point on the front, it was only 19mm. On the sides, protecting the driver, it was barely 9mm thick. In a war zone, that is not armor. That is sheet metal. A German infantryman with a standard heavy machine gun could shoot straight through the side of a Greyhound and kill the crew inside. To make matters even worse, the turret had no roof. It was completely open to the winter sky. If a German mortar shell exploded in the branches above, the razor-sharp shrapnel would rain down directly onto the men. If it snowed, they froze. They sat in freezing puddles of slush and oil, shivering against the cold steel. But the biggest joke of all, the detail that made it completely useless in a heavy fight, was its main weapon. Mounted in that open-top turret was a 37mm gun. By the brutal winter of 1944, tank armor had evolved so rapidly that the 37mm was hopelessly obsolete. The American soldiers refused to call it a cannon. They called it the peashooter. They called it the squirrel rifle. Firing a 37mm shell at a king tiger was mathematically useless. It was suicide. Because of this brutal reality, the United States Army had written a very strict doctrine for Greyhound crews. The official field manual was entirely clear. If you encounter enemy heavy armor, you have exactly one job. Put it in reverse, step on the gas, and run for your life. The men of Troop B, 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, knew the rules. They knew they were sitting in a tin can. They knew surviving the war meant knowing exactly when to run away. But out here, in the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge, the rules were disintegrating. Adolf Hitler had thrown everything he had into this massive surprise offensive. The American lines were collapsing. There was nowhere left to hide. There was nowhere left to run. The brilliant German engineers had calculated everything perfectly. The muzzle velocity, the armor thickness, the weight ratios, but they forgot to calculate one crucial variable. They forgot to calculate what happens when a terrified American crew, trapped in the snow with a useless peashooter, decides to stop running and do the absolutely impossible. December 16th, 1944. The temperature in the Ardennes forest plummeted well below freezing. A dense, heavy fog rolled through the dense pine trees. It was so thick and gray it felt like dirty wool. To the American soldiers freezing in their foxholes, the fog was a curse. It grounded the entire United States Army Air Forces. There would be no P-47 Thunderbolts to drop bombs. There would be no reconnaissance planes to spot the enemy. The Americans were completely blind. This sector of the front line was known as the Ghost Front. It was a quiet, frozen wilderness. The High Command used the Ardennes as a nursery to break in green rookies who had never seen combat, and as a rest camp for exhausted divisions recovering from heavy fighting. The men sitting in the snow thought the war was winding down. They were writing letters home. They were waiting for Christmas. They had absolutely no idea that just a few miles away, hidden beneath the dark canopy of the pine trees, Adolf Hitler had secretly massed a ghost army of his own. 250,000 German soldiers, over 1,000 heavy tanks and assault guns. They had moved only at night, their tracks muffled by straw laid across the roads, maintaining strict radio silence. They were a coiled spring, waiting for the perfect weather to strike. And the blinding fog was exactly what they needed. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the sky turned a brilliant, terrifying blood red. The dead silence of the Ghost Front was instantly shattered by the largest German artillery barrage the Americans had ever faced. Thousands of heavy guns ripped the forest apart. The explosions did not just shatter the frozen earth. They hit the tops of the massive 80-foot pine trees, turning the wood into millions of deadly, razor-sharp splinters that rained down on the American troops. It was a meat grinder. And then, when the artillery finally lifted, the true nightmare began. The ground began to vibrate. Out of the blinding white mist came the mechanical screams of heavy steel tracks. The panzers were coming. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the center of this absolute chaos was a small, freezing Belgian market town called Saint Vith. Saint Vith was not a military fortress. It did not have massive concrete walls or deep trenches. But it had something the German war machine desperately needed. Roads. 6 major highways and a vital railway line intersected directly in the center of Saint Vith. In the dense, muddy, heavily forested terrain of the Ardennes, 70-ton heavy tanks like the King Tiger cannot drive through the thick woods forever. They get stuck in the mud. They run out of gas. They need paved roads to survive. If the Germans could capture the Saint Vith crossroads, they could pour their massive armored columns straight into the heart of Belgium. They could split the Allied armies in half, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and potentially change the entire outcome of the Second World War. Saint Vith had to hold. It was the linchpin of the entire American defense. Defending this critical choke point was the American 7th Armored Division. They were hopelessly outnumbered. They were outgunned. They were fighting in a freezing white hell. The snow was falling so hard it covered the bodies of the dead before the combat medics could even reach them. The American lines were bending backward, stretching to the absolute breaking point. Pure panic was in the air. Supply trucks, jeeps, and retreating infantrymen were clogging the muddy trails, desperately trying to fall back from the overwhelming German armor. Right in the middle of this absolute bloodbath, positioned on the extreme flank of the American defensive line, was Troop B of the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. They were not heavy hitters. They were scouts. Their commanding officers had placed them near a narrow logging road just outside of Saint Vith, bordering a dense patch of forest. Inside their M8 Greyhound armored car, the three-man cavalry crew was freezing to death. The open-top turret offered absolutely zero protection from the bitter, cutting wind. They sat huddled in their heavy wool coats, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Snow drifted directly into the crew compartment, melting into freezing puddles of slush around their boots. The commander stared out through his binoculars into the thick white fog. He could not see more than 50 yards down the trail. The gunner kept his frozen hands near the cold steel breech of their 37mm peashooter. He knew that if heavy armor came down that road, his weapon was completely useless. The driver gripped the steering wheel, keeping the Ford Hercules engine idling low, just in case they needed to run. Their orders from command were crystal clear. Watch the road. If the Germans break through the main line, radio their position and fall back immediately. Do not engage. You are a light armored car, not a tank. If you see heavy armor, run for your lives. For hours, there was nothing but the howling wind and the distant, muffled thunder of heavy artillery shells shaking the snow off the trees. Then, the radio crackled with frantic, terrified reports. The German armored spearhead had broken through the primary defensive line. They were bypassing the heavy American roadblocks. They were moving down the secondary logging trails. They were coming right at them. The commander of the Greyhound held up his hand. Silence. He pulled his headset down and listened to the forest. Beneath the whistling of the wind, he heard it. The deep, rhythmic, terrifying thumping of a Maybach V12 engine. The heavy grinding of wide steel tracks crushing the frozen mud and snapping pine branches. The unmistakable, bone-rattling sound of a king tiger. The earth beneath the Greyhound's rubber tires began to shake. The dense fog ahead of them began to swirl and part. The dark shadows of the trees gave way to a massive wall of sloped yellow and green steel. The beast had found them. The king tiger did not just drive out of the forest, crushed the forest. The colossal 70-ton machine pushed through the dense tree line, snapping 80-foot-tall pine trees like dry twigs. The deep rumble of the Maybach V12 engine was a physical force, vibrating in the chests of every American soldier hidden in the snow. Through the thick, freezing fog, the monster finally revealed itself. It was painted in the dark yellow, green, and brown camouflage of the German heavy panzer battalions. The slope steel was coated in a rough, paste-like substance called simmerit, designed to stop magnetic mines. The heavy steel tracks, almost 3 feet wide, chewed up the frozen mud and spat it out in massive chunks. The tiger was leading the spearhead assault down the narrow logging trail towards Saint Vith. Just a few hundred yards down the road, directly in the path of the beast, the Americans had set up a desperate roadblock. Hidden behind a mound of snow and fallen logs was an American M4 Sherman tank. Alongside it, dug into the freezing mud, was a towed 57mm anti-tank gun. They were the last line of defense before the crossroads. The American gunners in the Sherman tank spotted the massive silhouette emerging from the fog. The tank commander screamed the order to fire. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's 75mm cannon roared. The heavy armor-piercing shell ripped through the freezing air at over 2,000 feet per second. It was a perfect, dead-center shot. Crack. The shell struck the upper front plate of the King Tiger. But there was no explosion. There was no fire. To the absolute horror of the American gunners, The heavy 75mm shell simply shattered against the 150mm of sloped Krupp steel. It sparked violently and ricocheted straight up into the dark sky, whistling harmlessly into the clouds. Inside the King Tiger, the German crew barely even felt the impact. It sounded like someone hitting the outside of the hull with a heavy sledgehammer. The German commander did not panic. He did not order evasive maneuvers. He simply pressed his face against his optical periscope, located the flash of the American cannon, and gave a single, calm order to his gunner. The massive, terrifying turret of the King Tiger began to slowly rotate. The hydraulic whine of the turret motor pierced the silence of the forest. It was a slow, methodical, mechanical sound of absolute death. The massive 88mm cannon lowered its barrel, aiming directly at the American roadblock. The muzzle flash was blinding. The sonic boom from the hypervelocity shell shattered the frozen branches off the surrounding trees. The 88mm shell did not just hit the Sherman tank. It annihilated it. The kinetic energy punched straight through the thickest part of the American armor as if it were made of cheap plastic. The Sherman erupted into a massive fireball, sending a column of thick black smoke rising into the freezing fog. The King Tiger did not stop, casually loaded a second shell. Boom! The American anti-tank gun was instantly vaporized in a shower of pulverized snow and twisted metal. In less than 60 seconds, the roadblock was completely wiped out. The road to Saint Vith was wide open. The King Tiger shifted its massive transmission, the diesel engine roaring as it slowly continued its march down the muddy trail. It was a predator taking a leisurely walk through a graveyard. It was completely, mathematically untouchable. But what the German commander did not know was that he was not alone. Just 30 yards off the side of the road, completely hidden in a dense thicket of pine branches and deep snow, the 3 men of the M8 Greyhound were watching the entire massacre unfold. The American cavalry commander, standing in the open-top turret, felt his blood run cold. He had just watched a 75mm armor-piercing shell bounce off the front of that monster like a thrown pebble. He looked down at his own weapon, the 37mm peashooter. It looked like a child's toy compared to the devastating 88mm cannon mounted on the Tiger. If a heavy tank shell could not even scratch the paint on the front of that German beast, firing a 37mm shell would be absolute suicide. It would only reveal their hidden position. And then, that massive hydraulic turret would slowly turn toward them and blow their thin sheet metal armored car into a million pieces. The driver of the Greyhound had his foot hovering anxiously over the gas pedal. The engine was idling at a low purr. He was staring at the transmission lever, waiting for the commander to scream the only logical order. Reverse. Get us out of here. According to the United States Army Field Manual, this was the exact moment they were supposed to run away. The roadblock had failed. The heavy armor was breaking through. Their job as scouts was done. They had to survive to radio the warning back to headquarters. The King Tiger was slowly rumbling closer. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards. The ground beneath the Greyhound was vibrating so violently that the cold steel of the armored car was rattling. The smell of unburned diesel fuel and thick exhaust filled the freezing air. The commander could feel the immense heat radiating off the 70-ton steel hull as it slowly drove past their hiding spot in the brush. He raised his hand. He signaled his driver to hold completely still. Do not move. Do not breathe. Let the monster pass. The massive side profile of the King Tiger filled his binoculars. He watched the massive steel road wheels crushing the mud. He watched the heavy side skirts deflecting the thick brush. And then, as the rear of the King Tiger slowly drove past their hiding spot, the American commander remembered a vital piece of intelligence. He remembered a briefing from military intelligence back in England, long before the Battle of the Bulge had even started. In the brutal mathematics of tank design, there is always a compromise. You cannot wrap a 70-ton tank in 150mm of steel on every single side. If you did, the tank would weigh 150 tons, and the engine would simply rip itself apart trying to move it. to give the King Tiger its invincible frontal armor. The brilliant engineers in Germany had to save weight somewhere else. They saved it in the rear. The armor plating covering the massive Maybach V12 engine compartment, located at the very back of the tank, was the thinnest steel on the entire machine. It was completely flat. It was not angled, and it was only 30 millimeters thick. 30 millimeters. The 37 millimeter peashooter mounted on the Greyhound was completely useless against the front. It was useless against the sides. But if it was fired at absolute point-blank range, directly into the flat rear armor plating, it could theoretically pierce the steel and destroy the engine. It was a mathematical possibility. But to take that shot, to exploit the one single flaw in the German masterpiece, the Greyhound crew would have to do something completely insane. They could not shoot from their hiding spot. The angle was wrong. They were parallel to the road. The only way to hit the flat rear armor was to get directly behind the King Tiger. They would have to break cover. They would have to drive their flimsy, open-topped armored car completely out into the open muddy road. They would have to accelerate their Ford Hercules engine and sprint directly up to the rear exhaust pipes of the deadliest tank on the planet. And they would have to do it before the German commander realized they were there, and before he could rotate his 88 millimeter cannon to vaporize them. It was a suicide run. A 50-yard sprint against a machine that had just annihilated a heavy American tank in 3 seconds. The King Tiger was 50 yards past their hiding spot, its massive exhaust pipes blowing thick black smoke into the fog. The American commander looked at his gunner. The gunner was trembling from the freezing cold, his hands resting on the breech of the 37 millimeter gun. The commander looked down at his driver. He did not order the driver to put the armored car in reverse. He leaned down, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the German tank. Put it in first gear and gun it. The driver of the American armored car did not hesitate. He slammed his heavy combat boot down onto the clutch, grabbed the steel gear shift lever, and shoved it violently into first gear. He stomped on the gas pedal. The Ford Hercules gasoline engine resting in the back of the M8 Greyhound did not purr. It screamed. For one agonizing second, the 6 rubber tires spun uselessly in the freezing slush and deep mud of the forest floor. And then, the thick rubber treads caught the solid frozen earth beneath the ice. The 8-ton armored car lunged violently out of the dense pine brush. Thick branches scraped against the thin sheet metal of the hull. A shower of white snow fell into the open-top turret, landing directly on the faces of the American commander and his gunner. They did not blink. They did not look away. Their eyes were locked completely on the massive, terrifying wall of yellow and green steel slowly driving away from them down the narrow logging trail. The Greyhound bounded out of the forest and hit the main road. They were now completely, utterly exposed. There was no more camouflage. There was no more hiding. If there was a single German infantryman walking behind that tank, or a secondary panzer following in its wake, the 3 Americans would be slaughtered in a hail of machine gun fire. But there was no one else. The King Tiger was operating as the lonely tip of the spear, and now, right behind it, was a highly suicidal American armored car. The driver slammed the gear shift into second, then third. The Greyhound accelerated down the muddy trail, closing the distance with terrifying speed. 50 yards, 45 yards, 40 yards. Inside the massive steel cavern of the King Tiger, the noise was absolutely deafening. The Maybach V12 engine roared like a mechanical dragon. The steel tracks clanked and squealed against the frozen mud. But the German tank commander was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had survived the freezing bloodbaths of Russia. He knew the sounds of his own machine perfectly, through his heavy leather headset, beneath the roar of his own diesel engine. He heard a high-pitched whine. It was not a heavy tank. It was a high-revving gasoline engine, and it was right behind him. The German commander pressed his face against his rear-facing periscope. Through the thick, swirling winter fog, and the black exhaust smoke pouring out of his own tank, he saw it. A tiny, open-topped American armored car, charging directly at his rear exhaust pipes like an angry hornet. For a fraction of a second, the German commander was completely confused. It made absolutely no logical sense. The American vehicle was completely unarmored. His gun was entirely useless. It was a tin can on rubber wheels. Why in the name of God was it charging a 70-ton King Tiger? And then, the blood drained from the German commander's face. He realized exactly what the Americans were doing. They were going for the flat, 30mm steel plate covering his engine compartment, the absolute weakest point on the entire fortress. The German commander slammed his hand against the shoulder of his gunner. He screamed into the internal intercom system. Enemy armor in the rear. Traverse turret. 180 degrees. Now! The German gunner panicked. He grabbed the heavy hydraulic control wheels and slammed them to the maximum setting. The massive, terrifying turret of the King Tiger began to turn. But physics is a cruel master. You cannot instantly spin a turret that weighs hundreds of thousands of pounds. It requires immense mechanical torque. Even at maximum hydraulic power, the King Tiger required at least 20 agonizing seconds to rotate its massive 88mm cannon completely around to the rear. It was a race of absolute, brutal mechanics. The slow, hydraulic whine of the German turret versus the speeding rubber tires of the American armored car. If that massive cannon reached the Greyhound before they fired, the 88mm shell would vaporize the American crew. It would completely erase them from existence. The American commander stood in the freezing open turret, watching the massive German gun begin to swing toward them. The long steel barrel of the King Tiger was sweeping violently across the tree line, snapping thick pine branches in half as the massive turret rotated backward. 35 yards. 30 yards. The American driver slammed on the brakes. The 6 heavy rubber tires locked up. The Greyhound skidded violently through the freezing mud, sliding sideways before coming to a dead stop exactly 25 yards behind the King Tiger. 25 yards. They were so close that the American commander could smell the burning diesel fuel and the hot grease radiating off the German exhaust pipes. He could see the individual bolts holding the rear armor plate together. He could read the painted serial numbers on the steel. The massive German turret was halfway there. 90 degrees. The black hole of the 88mm muzzle was slowly turning to look right at them. The American commander did not use his radio. He simply screamed at his gunner over the roar of the engines. Fire! The American gunner had his eye pressed against the optical sight. His freezing fingers squeezed the mechanical trigger. The 37mm peashooter roared to life. Crack! The sharp, high-pitched crack of the American gun echoed through the dense pine forest. The brass casing ejected violently from the breech, clattering onto the freezing metal floor of the armored car. The smell of burning cordite instantly filled the open air. At 25 yards, the armor-piercing shell covered the distance in a fraction of a millisecond. It slammed dead center into the flat rear armor plating of the King Tiger. Sparks showered into the freezing fog. But the massive German tank did not stop. The Maybach engine sputtered, coughing thick black smoke, but it kept running. And the terrifying hydraulic whine of the turret continued. 120 degrees. The massive gun barrel was clearing the trees. It was almost pointing directly at them. The American loader did not wait for an order. He was moving on pure, terrifying adrenaline. He grabbed another 37mm shell from the ready rack, shoved it violently into the open breech, and slammed the heavy steel block shut. Up! He screamed. The gunner squeezed the trigger a second time. Crack! The second armor-piercing shell ripped through the fog and struck the exact same rear armor plate. The steel began to buckle. The sheer kinetic energy of 2 consecutive point-blank impacts was shattering the structural integrity of the Krupp steel. Inside the King Tiger, warning alarms began to scream. The heavy engine was choking. The rear compartment was filling with blinding white smoke. But the turret kept turning. 150 degrees. The American commander could now look directly down the dark, terrifying barrel of the 88mm cannon. It looked like the mouth of a bottomless cave. The German gunner was screaming. He just needed 2 more seconds. 2 more seconds to lock the crosshairs on the open top of the American armored car and pull the firing lanyard. The Greyhound crew had time for exactly one last shot. If it failed, they were dead. The loader shoved a third shell into the breech. His hands were bleeding from slamming the steel block shut. He didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel the freezing cold. Up! The American commander stared straight down the barrel of the 88mm gun, aiming directly at his face. Fire! Crack! The third 37mm shell tore across the 25-yard gap. It hit the fractured, heavily damaged rear plate of the King Tiger. And this time, the German steel finally surrendered. The armor-piercing shell punched completely through the 30mm plate. It entered the highly pressurized engine compartment of the Maybach V12. It shattered the fuel lines. It shredded the heavy cooling fans. And it sent a shower of superheated shrapnel directly into the engine block and the rear ammunition storage bins. For one terrifying second, there was absolute silence in the forest. The hydraulic whine of the turret motor suddenly died. The massive 88mm cannon stopped turning, freezing in place just inches away from aiming directly at the American Greyhound. And then, the monster finally died. A massive, blinding fireball erupted from the rear engine deck of the King Tiger. A shockwave of heat and expanding gas blew the heavy steel engine covers straight up into the dark winter sky. Thick, choking black smoke billowed out of the shattered armor. The invincible 70-ton Leviathan ground to a violent, sudden halt in the deep mud. The King Tiger was dead. The 3 Americans sitting in their open-top tin can did not celebrate. They did not cheer. They simply sat in absolute, stunned silence, watching the greatest tank in the world burn to the ground from a distance of 25 yards. The impossible had just happened. The peashooter had killed the king. The fireball rising from the rear deck of the King Tiger was blinding. In the freezing, gray fog of the Ardennes forest, the heat radiating from the burning 70-ton monster was so intense that it instantly melted the thick snow around its steel tracks. The freezing puddles of mud began to boil. Inside the cavernous hull of the German Panzer, absolute panic took hold. The 3 point-blank hits from the American 37mm peashooter had shattered the engine block and severed the main fuel lines. The highly flammable diesel fuel was pouring over the red-hot steel of the Maybach V12 engine. The fire was spreading rapidly toward the massive ammunition storage bins holding the 88mm shells. If those shells cooked off, the entire tank would detonate with the force of a massive bomb. The heavy steel hatches on top of the King Tiger's turret violently kicked open. Thick, choking black smoke poured out into the freezing air. One by one, the surviving German crew members scrambled out of the burning hatches. They were wearing their black Panzer uniforms, their faces covered in black soot and engine oil. They did not grab their weapons. They did not try to return fire. They threw themselves blindly off the sides of the towering 70-ton beast, tumbling wildly into the deep snow and crawling desperately away from the imminent explosion. They did not even look back to see what had killed them. They probably assumed it was a heavy American tank destroyer, or a hidden battery of heavy artillery. They could never have imagined, in their wildest nightmares, that their invincible fortress of Krupp steel had just been assassinated by an 8-ton armored car. 25 yards away, sitting completely exposed on the muddy logging trail, the 3 Americans in the M8 Greyhound watched the German crew run for their lives. The American commander's heart was hammering against his ribs. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his binoculars. He looked at his gunner. The gunner was staring blankly at the smoking breech of his 37mm gun, completely stunned by what he had just done. But the Battle of Saint Vith was not over. The burning King Tiger was just the tip of the spear. There was an entire armored column of German panzers and infantry moving through the forest behind it. The pillar of thick black smoke rising into the winter sky was going to act like a giant beacon. If the Greyhounds stayed on that road for even one more minute, they would be slaughtered. The American commander slapped his headset. "Put it in reverse. Get us the hell out of here." The driver did not need to be told twice. He slammed the heavy steel gear shift into reverse and stomped on the gas pedal. The Ford Hercules engine screamed as the Greyhound lurched backward. The 6 heavy rubber tires spun in the freezing mud, kicking up a massive shower of slush and dirty snow. The 8-ton armored car slipped backward off the main logging trail. It crashed through the thick pine branches, reversing rapidly into the deep, dark shadows of the forest. Within seconds, the swirling gray fog rolled back over the road. The dense trees swallowed the small armored car completely. When the rest of the German armored column finally arrived at the scene a few minutes later, they found nothing but their burning masterpiece. There were no American tanks. There were no anti-tank guns. The assassin had simply vanished like a ghost in the snow. Back in the warm, comfortable offices of the Henschel Weapons Factory in Kassel, Germany, the brilliant engineers had drawn the perfect blueprints. They had created a mathematical masterpiece. They believed that warfare was an exact science. They believed that if you built a tank with 150 millimeters of sloped armor and armed it with the most devastating 88 millimeter cannon ever designed, you would win the war. They believed in the absolute superiority of the machine. But the ambush at Saint Vith proved the fatal flaw in the German philosophy of war. The engineers had built a massive, heavily armored cathedral of steel. But a cathedral cannot turn fast enough when a desperate enemy gets behind it. The American philosophy of war was completely different. The United States did not try to build the perfect tank. They built machines that were light, fast, simple, and mass-produced by the tens of thousands in the factories of Detroit. The M8 Greyhound was not a masterpiece. It was a cheap, open-top tin can. Its armor was paper-thin. Its gun was a complete joke. On paper, if you put a Greyhound and a King Tiger in an open field, the King Tiger wins 100 times out of 100. But wars are not fought on paper. Wars are fought in the terrifying reality of the mud. They are fought in the blinding fog of the Ardennes forest, where visibility drops to 0 and 70-ton tanks cannot maneuver in the thick trees. And most importantly, wars are fought by human beings. The German engineers could calculate the exact tensile strength of their armor plating. But there is no mathematical formula, no equation, and no blueprint in the world that can calculate the sheer, terrifying willpower of an American cavalry crew with their backs against the wall. When the men of Troop B realized they could not run, they did not surrender. They used the only 2 weapons they had left: extreme speed and absolute, suicidal courage. They exploited the single 30-millimeter flaw in the German armor, and they executed the most impossible 50-yard sprint in the history of armored warfare. The heroic defense of the Saint Vith crossroads by the American 7th Armored Division, and the desperate actions of cavalry scouts like the men in that Greyhound, completely destroyed the strict timetable of Adolf Hitler's surprise offensive. The Germans needed the roads immediately, but the Americans held the line just long enough to ruin the entire German plan. By the time the weather finally cleared and the American bomber planes returned to the skies, the Battle of the Bulge was essentially over. The back of the German war machine had been permanently broken. Today, history books and military documentaries are obsessed with the giants of the Second World War. We love the massive statistics. We love the terrifying silhouette of the King Tiger. We love the stories of the biggest guns and the thickest armor. It is easy to look at the massive, lumbering beasts of war and believe that raw power is the only thing that matters. But deep in the freezing pine forests of Belgium, in the darkest days of December 1944, a different truth was written in the snow. It is a reminder that, in the absolute chaos of combat, perfection is an illusion. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not the 70-ton monster with the devastating cannon. Sometimes, the deadliest thing in the world is a vulnerable, open-top tin can, armed with a useless peashooter, driven by men who simply refuse to die.